Some curses are not born of steel or spectres, but of greed that corrodes the soul. It begins with a shattered family relic, a sword said to be cursed, and a death cloaked in whispers at a manor where shadows watch more keenly than men. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us step into Redgrave Manor, where every echo may conceal a truth too dreadful to rest. It was upon a bitter winter evening that I found myself once more in our familiar lodgings of Baker Street. The fog hung low over London, pressing against the window panes like some formless intruder, and the air within our rooms carried the faint, acrid trace of Holmes's pipe smoke. My companion sat in his chair by the fire, his profile cast in stark relief by the flickering light. He had been curiously silent for hours, his hawk-like features set in contemplation, his gaze fixed not upon me, but upon some private constellation of thought. I confess that I felt the weight of his silence with more than usual intensity, for there was a peculiarity in it, a sharpness, as though he were awaiting the arrival of something inevitable. I stirred restlessly, with a medical journal in hand, but the words blurred before me. All at once, Holmes straightened slightly, his sharp eyes turning toward the door, before any knock had sounded. "You will hear footsteps on the stair in but a moment, Watson," he remarked softly. "And if I am not mistaken, they are the footsteps of desperation." Even as he spoke, a quick, uncertain tapping resounded in the hallway below, growing louder as it climbed toward us. The sound broke through the heavy stillness of the night. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread crossed the landing, and a moment later, the door opened to admit a young lady whose pallor struck me as more chilling than the weather itself. Her cloak, damp with mist, clung to her shoulders, and her gloved hands trembled as she clutched them together. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Glimmering faintly in the firelight, lay the shattered remains of a sword. "This," she whispered, "is the Redgrave blade. It has passed from generation to generation for centuries. They said it would not break. And yet—" Her voice faltered. She raised her eyes to us, and I saw that they were clouded with both fear and disbelief. "It shattered in my cousin's hand upon the very night he was struck down. They call it an accident, a tragic duel in the darkened hall of our manor. But I tell you, it was no accident. The blade should not have failed him, and since that night whispers have spread that the sword was cursed, that the Redgrave line is doomed." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers running lightly over the jagged edges of the steel. His face betrayed no superstition, only keen interest. He turned one fragment slowly in the firelight, his lips tightening as his eyes traced minute grooves invisible to me. At last he set it down. "This blade did not break by chance, Watson," he said quietly. "It was broken, deliberately broken, to conceal something within." Lady Eleanor gasped. I felt my pulse quicken, for in that dim-lit chamber, with the broken relic before us, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of a mystery whose shadow reached far beyond the grasp of ordinary crime. Lady Eleanor's voice faltered as her gaze returned to the fragments of steel upon the table. "It is said," she murmured, her tone scarcely above a whisper, "that the Redgrave sword was forged in blood, and that those unworthy of the name would meet their end should they take it in hand. Since my cousin's death, the servants whisper of the curse. Some claim to have heard footsteps in the empty halls at night. Others speak of a shadowed figure lingering by the family chapel. They fear the sword has claimed its due." Her words hung in the air like a chill draught through a shuttered room. I confess, even as a man of medicine, my pulse quickened at the suggestion of a legacy tainted by such superstition, for there was a strange solemnity in her manner, as though she herself half believed the tale she repeated. Holmes, however, remained composed, his eyes fixed keenly upon her face. "A convenient superstition, Lady Eleanor," he remarked with quiet authority. "Curses are but screens, designed to obscure motives of flesh and blood. Behind every whisper lies a human hand guiding the tale. The question is, whose hand? I noted that Eleanor did not answer at once, and in the silence her unease deepened, as though she feared to speak more plainly. Holmes leaned back, his gaze narrowing toward the relic itself. "Let us leave legends to the poets," he said at last. "Steel tells a clearer tale than any ghost." With that, Holmes drew the fragments of the blade closer, arranging them carefully upon the table. His fingers moved with delicate precision, like those of a surgeon intent upon a life. He studied the fracture lines with his magnifying lens, the firelight glinting across the polished steel. "Note, Watson," he said, tilting one fragment toward me. "The grain of the breakage. Were this merely the consequence of stress or age, the fracture would run naturally with the steel's temper. But observe here." He pointed to a minute indentation along the edge. This was weakened, scored by a file perhaps, or treated with acid. The blade was prepared to fail. I bent forward, astonished. Then it was no accident. The sword was made to break. Holmes gave a thin smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Precisely. It is not the steel which betrayed the Redgraves, but a man's cunning." Lady Eleanor clasped her hands more tightly. "But why? Why shatter the sword?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He ran his fingers along the hilt, pausing where the leather grip had worn away. His expression sharpened. "Because, my lady," the fog pressed thick against the glass. In that dim chamber, it seemed as though the very air recoiled from what Holmes had revealed. Holmes rose at last, his eyes gleaming with that fierce light I had come to know so well when his intellect was fully roused. "Watson, Lady Eleanor," he said gravely, "the Redgrave blade has spoken. It tells us of deceit, of hidden truths, and of a hand determined to bury them. We must go to Redgrave Manor itself, for there, amid whispers of curses and shadows of the past, the truth awaits." The fire crackled in uneasy response, and I could not help but feel that we had crossed the threshold into a darkness from which there would be no simple return. The morning after Lady Eleanor's visit found Holmes and me bound for the countryside. Our carriage rolled steadily along a desolate road, flanked on either side by bare hedgerows that stood like black sentinels against the winter sky. The fog, which clung to London's narrow streets, had not forsaken the countryside, but spread itself in long trailing sheets across the fields, veiling church spires and farmhouse chimneys alike. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean figure enveloped in his greatcoat, his hawk-like features touched by no trace of fatigue from the journey. His eyes were fixed on the shifting landscape beyond the window, though I suspected his gaze was turned inward, weighing evidence and arranging thoughts in the orderly fashion of his remarkable mind. For myself, I could not shake the unease instilled by Lady Eleanor's tale. A broken blade, a sudden death, and whispers of an ancestral curse. Such things might stir superstition even in a rational man, and I am not ashamed to confess that I felt a foreboding chill as our destination drew nearer. "We enter, Watson," Holmes said at last, breaking his long silence. "Not into a tale of spirits, but into the theatre of human deceit. Remember that, and it shall serve you well when the hour grows dark." It was a comfort, though not a lasting one, for the barren hills and the sullen roll of mist spoke more eloquently than reason of a house weighed down by shadow. By afternoon, the carriage turned sharply into a narrow lane bordered by leafless oaks. At its end rose Redgrave Manor, an edifice of grey stone, vast yet decayed, its turrets rising like warning fingers into the ashen sky. Windows, dark and unwelcoming, stared blankly down upon us. As we alighted, the heavy oak doors swung open, not with welcome, but with reluctant duty. A servant, stiff and suspicious, admitted us with a bow more mechanical than courteous. The hall within was cavernous, its air colder than the day without, and the silence broken only by the echo of our footsteps across the flagstones. The walls bore portraits darkened with age, and it was as if the eyes of the long-dead Redgraves regarded our intrusion with disdain. The very air seemed to whisper of feuds, betrayals, and the weight of secrets buried too long. Holmes, undaunted, cast his keen glance over the surroundings. "Note, Watson," he murmured, "how decay is permitted here to advance unchecked. A house that permits neglect of stone and wood may well conceal a deeper neglect of honour." The servants who passed us did so with furtive eyes, their expressions unreadable. It seemed to me that even they carried some unspoken knowledge, a dread that hung upon them like a shroud. Thus, with the air of suspicion thick about us, we crossed the threshold fully into the domain of the Redgraves. We were conducted at last into a sombre drawing-room, where Lady Eleanor awaited us. Her face bore the fatigue of a sleepless night, yet her composure remained unbroken. She rose to greet us, though her glance darted nervously toward the other occupants of the room. There, by the fire, stood a man of stern countenance, whose lined features spoke of bitterness rather than wisdom. He was introduced as Sir Reginald Redgrave, Eleanor's uncle. His eyes, sharp and cold, regarded us with suspicion, as though we were intruders prying into affairs best left untouched. Beside him, seated upon a chaise, was Mrs. Clara Redgrave, and every shadowed glance. "Here, Watson," he whispered to me as Sir Reginald began a reluctant account of the tragedy, "is the true battleground. Not steel against steel, but truth against deception." We were escorted to the manor's armoury, a vast and shadowed chamber whose walls were crowded with relics of battle, pikes, halberds, and tarnished breastplates that bore the scars of long-forgotten wars. The broken Redgrave blade had been placed upon a stand of oak, its fragments gleaming dully beneath the cold light that seeped through narrow windows. Holmes moved forward at once, his keen gaze alight with interest. He bent low, the tips of his long fingers brushing delicately over the fracture, and with a sudden flourish produced his magnifying lens from his pocket. I watched as he studied every line of the break with silent intensity. "Observe, Watson," he murmured at length, his voice taut with significance. "The grain of this steel is uneven. Here, do you see it? A tiny channel etched into the metal, unnatural in its formation. This is not the hand of time, but of design. The blade was not broken in contest. It was betrayed before ever it was raised." Lady Eleanor's breath caught audibly. Sir Reginald shifted with impatience, as though Holmes's deductions threatened to lay bare something long concealed. "Sabotage?" I asked, though the word felt inadequate. "More than sabotage," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "This sword was weakened, scored, perhaps filed, or exposed to a corrosive substance. It was meant to shatter." His words echoed in that armoury filled with the husks of battle, and I could not help but feel that we stood not in a museum of history, but in a mausoleum where the truth itself was being entombed. Leaving the armoury, we traversed the long gallery that led back toward the great hall. The corridor was lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their oil-darkened visages looming out of gilt frames. The largest of these hung at the gallery's end, a full-length depiction of a knight clad in armour, the sword of Redgrave clasped proudly in his mailed hands. I found myself arrested before it, for the figure's eyes, though wrought only in paint, seemed to burn with a strange vitality. As I gazed, I felt a prickling along my spine, as though the knight's gaze had detached itself from the canvas and fastened upon me. "Curious, is it not, Watson?" Holmes remarked quietly beside me, that art may so persuade the senses. Yet what you feel is not the supernatural. It is the weight of suggestion, fostered by a house steeped in whisper and dread. Still, I could not shake the impression. The night's stare seemed alive with judgment, and I wondered how many generations of Redgraves had lived beneath those painted eyes, feeling their every secret measured and condemned. Lady Eleanor, observing my disquiet, whispered, "They say Sir Alaric, the knight, still watches over the manor. Some servants claim his shadow moves when the moonlight strikes the hall." Holmes gave a thin smile, though there was no mirth in it. "Servants' tales, Lady Eleanor. Yet such tales are useful, for they tell us not of ghosts, but of the fears men nurture when guilt walks beside them." We had scarcely re-entered the great hall when it came, the sound that tore through the house like a knife through silence, a scream, raw and terrible, echoing from the corridor above. It was no ordinary cry, but one born of terror, so piercing that my very blood ran cold. Lady Eleanor clutched the banister with both hands, her face drained of colour. Sir Reginald started from his chair, his grim mask breaking at last into alarm. Holmes was already in motion, his eyes flashing with that peculiar brightness that I had seen when the game pressed nearest to its crisis. "Come, Watson," he cried, and his long strides carried him swiftly toward the stair. As we ascended, the scream fell into silence, leaving only the hollow thud of hurried footsteps retreating down the passage. The air itself seemed to thicken with dread as we reached the landing, where shadows pooled in every corner. I confess that my heart beat with a force that seemed to shake the very floor beneath me. Somewhere in this house, another life had been threatened. Or worse. Holmes paused at the threshold, Redgrave knight himself, his mailed hand resting upon the very sword that now lay broken. Though I told myself these were but tales born of terror, I could not wholly dispel the creeping chill that clung to me. The house seemed to bristle with unseen eyes, each draught a whisper, each creak of timber a warning. Even I, who had faced death upon battlefields, found my nerves tested by that old and brooding place. Holmes, however, strode through the manor with his accustomed briskness, as if fear itself recoiled from his presence. Yet I knew him too well not to see the spark in his eyes, a man who had scented not the supernatural, but the unmistakable trace of deceit. That evening, gathered once more in the hall, the family spoke in guarded tones of the supposed curse. Sir Reginald, with bitterness in his voice, declared that the Redgrave line had always been shadowed by ill fortune. The widow trembled and muttered of fate, while Henry, the resentful heir, scoffed aloud, yet could not hide his unease. Holmes listened with folded arms, his face as unreadable as stone. At last he spoke, his voice cutting through the murmur like the strike of a blade. "Superstition is the coward's refuge," he said coldly. "Curses are the convenient cloak beneath which crimes are committed and concealed. Your knight does not walk your halls, Lady Eleanor, but there is one who does, one of flesh and blood, who profits by such fears." A hush fell, each face turning toward another with suspicion. The widow gave a strangled sob, while Sir Reginald's lips tightened in disdain. Holmes's eyes swept the assembly, pausing long enough upon each countenance to make even the boldest uneasy. Then, without further word, he turned and strode toward the armoury. "Come, Watson," he commanded. "The steel will tell us more than these trembling tongues." I followed, my heart. Within the armoury, where shadows clung thickly to the rafters, Holmes laid the fragments of the sword upon a work table. His hands moved with swift certainty, probing the hilt with the point of his knife. At first there was nothing but the scrape of metal on metal, until suddenly a small section of the guard shifted beneath his pressure. "There," he murmured, prizing it open. A hollow cavity revealed itself, scarcely large enough for a folded sheet of paper or a locket. A residue of wax clung faintly to the interior. I leaned closer, astonished. A hidden compartment! Holmes's eyes gleamed with fierce triumph. Just so. This sword was a reliquary, Watson. Not merely of steel, but of secrets. It once contained something of grave importance, something worth killing for. When summoned, the family crowded around the discovery. Yet their responses were curiously uniform. Each insisted that the compartment had always been empty, that no such secret had ever been hidden there. Holmes's lip curled in contempt. A lie, spoken too swiftly and by too many tongues. No, my friends, there was something here, and its absence speaks more loudly than its presence. Lady Eleanor trembled, her eyes darting to her uncle, then away again. I felt a strange dread settle upon me, for it seemed to me that the sword, broken though it was, had indeed found its voice, and what it spoke was accusation. Holmes confronted the family with the discovery of the hollow in the hilt, yet what followed was not relief at progress, but a flood of denial. Each insisted with undue haste that nothing had ever rested within it. Sir Reginald's voice carried an edge of authority, declaring it an empty curiosity, while Henry's tone was sharp with irritation, as though the very suggestion insulted him. Even the widow, timid and pale, echoed their words too quickly, her hands trembling in her lap. I watched Holmes as he observed them, his expression weight of the day's revelations. The corridors of Redgrave Manor groaned under the wind, and the distant tapping of branches upon the window sounded like skeletal fingers. I had just resigned myself to uneasy slumber when a sound, faint and haunting, drifted through the stillness. It was music, low and mournful, like the notes of a violin played far beyond its strength, each tone lingering as though reluctant to die. The melody was unfamiliar, yet it carried such sorrow that it stirred my heart with a strange dread. I rose and approached the window. The sound came not from within, but from the grounds beyond, seeping through the mist that curled about the chapel and armoury. Against all reason, and armed with nothing but my courage, I took up my lantern and ventured into the night. The air was bitterly cold, and each breath rose like smoke before me. The fog pressed close, veiling the manor until it seemed I had stepped into a world apart. The music guided me, pulling me farther from safety with each fragile note. At last the melody ceased, breaking off as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was so profound that I fancied I could hear the beating of my own heart. Then, from the chapel's shadow, came the scrape of earth being moved, slow and deliberate. I approached cautiously, the lantern trembling in my grasp. There, half hidden by mist, crouched a figure cloaked in black, its hands working feverishly at the soil. The shape froze at the sight of my light, then straightened with unnatural swiftness before darting into the fog. I made to pursue, but a firm hand caught my shoulder. "Watson," came Holmes's steady voice, calm though edged with triumph. "Stay your chase. We have found what matters most." He stooped at the disturbed ground, his long fingers sifting the damp soil, until they closed upon something soft. He raised it to "A bloodied token," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming, "and buried in haste beside the chapel. No place better chosen to clothe crime in sanctity. But see here, Watson, this is no accident. The blade broke to conceal a secret, and now we hold proof that death followed its betrayal. I swallowed hard, the chill of the night sinking into my very bones. Around us the fog swirled, carrying with it the echo of phantom music, though no hand touched bow or string. The manor loomed in silence, every shuttered window dark, yet I felt certain unseen eyes watched us from behind the glass. Holmes slipped the glove carefully into his pocket. "The sword speaks, Watson," he said gravely, "but not all will listen truthfully. We are closer to the heart of this affair, and closer, too, to danger." The morning after our grim discovery by the chapel, Holmes gathered the family once more in the great hall. The fire sputtered weakly in the grate, throwing uneasy shadows upon the faces assembled. Sir Reginald sat stiff and scowling. Henry leaned back with arms crossed and a restless tapping of his foot, while the widow Clara kept her gaze fixed upon her trembling hands. Lady Eleanor, pale with apprehension, stood apart, her eyes betraying a desperate hope that Holmes would pierce the darkness clouding her house. Holmes began without flourish, his voice calm but edged like tempered steel. "Your cousin did not die by chance, nor did this sword fail by flaw of metal. A hand guided its breaking, and a mind plotted his fall. Let us then hear again the story of that night." What followed was a chorus of half-truths and evasions. Sir Reginald's account faltered when Holmes pressed him on the hour he had last seen his nephew. Henry contradicted himself within moments, first claiming to have heard the clash of steel, then confessing he had been in the stables. The widow's sobbing recital dissolved into silence when Holmes asked what she knew of the sword's hidden cavity. I sat in growing astonishment as Holmes led them with question upon question, his voice sharpening with each reply, until the walls themselves seemed to reverberate with their deceit. Never had I seen him so relentless, nor the household so undone by their own contradictions. "Observe, Watson," he whispered to me in passing. The widow sobbed again, though no words passed her lips. Henry's defiance flickered, while Sir Reginald's face hardened like stone. Holmes continued, his voice low, yet thunderous in its effect. "The sword did not break through chance. It was weakened, and when it failed, it left your cousin defenseless, struck down before witnesses could discern the deception. An accident, so it seemed. Yet I tell you, it was a performance, rehearsed and enacted with deadly precision." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the portraits looming above us seemed to lean forward, as if the painted Redgraves hungered for the truth to be spoken aloud. "Then it was murder," Lady Eleanor whispered. Holmes inclined his head. "Murder, veiled beneath honour's mask." Holmes turned the fragments of the hilt in his hands, his eyes narrowing with cold clarity. "And there is more. Within this sword once lay hidden documents, folded and sealed, now vanished. I have examined the cavity. Traces of wax remain, but what was secreted there has been removed." Sir Reginald shifted uneasily, though he forced his features to remain impassive. Henry muttered an oath under his breath. The widow's sobbing grew louder, though whether from fear or guilt I could not determine. Holmes pressed on. Those documents were no idle relics. They were forged papers, I believe, papers contrived to alter the line of inheritance. Your cousin, the rightful heir, discovered this treachery. That discovery cost him his life. The sword, both relic and reliquary, was broken to conceal its betrayal. The words fell like a verdict upon the gathered household. Lady Eleanor swayed as though struck, and I hastened to steady her. Sir Reginald's lips moved, yet no protest came forth. Henry's face grew livid, his hand tightening upon the arm of his chair until his knuckles whitened. Holmes's gaze, sharp as the edge of any blade, swept them all. There lies the heart of it. Not curses, not ghosts, but the basest of motives, greed. It is inheritance, gentlemen, not phantoms that haunts this house. I could feel the weight of his words settle over us, darker than the fog pressing against the windows, and knew that the truth, though revealed, was only the prelude to greater revelations still to come. Holmes turned his attention at last to Clara Redgrave, the widow. Until then she had sat with head bowed, her hands twisting ceaselessly in her lap, her frail frame trembling at every pointed word. Holmes's gaze fixed upon her now, sharp and unsparing. "Madam," he said, his tone softened only by its precision. "You were present when the duel was staged. You saw the sword fail, and I tell you plainly, you know more than you admit." She started as though struck. Her lips moved soundlessly before a sob escaped her. I cannot," she whispered, her eyes darting towards Sir Reginald. Holmes leaned closer, his voice low but inexorable. "Your fear betrays you, madam. Yet I see it is not guilt that shakes you, but the weight of secrets forced upon you. You are no architect of this crime. You are its prisoner." The widow's composure collapsed. She pressed her face into her hands and wept openly, her frail shoulders convulsing with the burden of silence too long borne. Lady Eleanor rushed to her side, but Holmes raised a hand, his eyes glittering. "Let her speak if she will. The truth, Watson, struggles to free itself." But no confession came. Instead, the widow's sobbing grew so violent that words were lost in grief. Holmes drew back, his mouth tightening. "So," he murmured, "the hand that pulls the strings remains hidden, while the puppet suffers in silence." Later, as we stood apart, Holmes spoke to me in a tone grim with certainty. Watson is near at hand, but so too is danger, and when the guilty hand sees its web unravel, it will strike with fire." The words had scarcely left his lips when the alarm was raised. A servant burst into the hall, his face ashen, shouting of smoke. In an instant Holmes was moving, his coat flaring behind him as we rushed toward the armory. The stench of burning oak and oil met us before we reached the door. Flames licked greedily at the rafters, their glow casting the weapons upon the walls into a grotesque dance of steel and shadow. Panic reigned. Servants ran hither and thither with buckets, while the family cried out in horror as their relics turned to ash. Holmes, however, was unmoved by the chaos. His eyes cut through smoke and flame, as though searching for something far more elusive than safety. And then I saw it too. A figure, half obscured in the thick haze, its form flickering like a phantom as it lifted a torch to the dry timber. "The ghost!" cried one of the servants in terror. But Holmes's voice rang out above the din, steady and commanding. "Not a ghost, but the hand of a man!" The figure turned, its face concealed by shadow, then vanished into the smoke. But in that fleeting instant, Holmes's keen gaze fixed upon it, and I knew he had seen what others had not. "Watson," he said, gripping my arm with sudden force, "the mask begins to slip. The fire is but a desperate veil. Behind it, the truth waits to strike." Holmes had spoken little after the fire, yet I recognized in his silence not defeat, but calculation. The blaze had consumed evidence, but not his certainty. Late that evening, when the household had withdrawn in uneasy quiet, he beckoned me to his side with the briefest of smiles. "Watson, the time has come to draw the serpent from its hole. It is not enough to know the truth. We must compel it to reveal itself before all." He laid out his stratagem with brisk clarity. Word was to be allowed to reach the family that Holmes had discovered the missing half of the broken sword, a fragment said to contain the concealed papers. By dawn, it would be whispered that the evidence lay secured in a cabinet within the hall. "Such a morsel cannot be resisted," Holmes said softly, his eyes gleaming. The guilty hand will grope for it before the night is over. We need only be present when it does. I marveled, as I often did, at his capacity to weave deception against deceivers, to ensnare cunning with cunning. And yet, as I watched him place the false fragment within its hiding place, I felt a chill. For it seemed we had set not a snare for a man, but for something darker that stalked the Redgrave halls under cloak of night. The household retired, leaving the manor steeped in oppressive silence. Holmes and I concealed ourselves in the gallery that overlooked the hall, the dim glow of a single lamp below casting grotesque shadows upon the stone floor. The hours dragged with glacial slowness. I could hear the tick of the great clock, each strike reverberating like the toll of a distant bell. The wind moaned in the chimneys, and now and again a board creaked as though under unseen footsteps. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and though I clutched my revolver, the weight of it gave me little comfort. Holmes sat beside me, motionless as a figure carved in stone, his gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the cabinet. His calmness steadied me, though the oppressive air gnawed at my nerves. He had the look of a hunter certain of his quarry, waiting with infinite patience for the beast to emerge. At last, near the stroke of 2, the hush of the manor was broken by the faint scrape of a door, followed by the stealth of padded steps upon the stair. Holmes's hand, light but firm, touched my arm. "Steady, Watson. The play begins." From the gloom of the corridor above, a figure emerged, cloaked, hooded, its steps careful yet urgent. It descended into the hall with the sureness of one who knew every stone of the house. The lamplight caught brief, its very walls eager for the truth to burst forth like a storm. Holmes did not rush to reveal himself, but waited until Sir Reginald's hand closed upon the cabinet. Then, with sudden swiftness, he struck a match of his own, flooding the hall with light. The uncle froze, his face contorted in fury and shock. "Sir Reginald Redgrave," Holmes declared, his voice carrying through the vast hall like a tolling bell. "The mask has slipped. It was you who arranged the duel, you who shattered the sword, you who cloaked crime in superstition. The ghost of Redgrave Manor is no phantom, it is you." The uncle's lips curled, yet he made no answer. Holmes advanced a step, his eyes gleaming with pitiless precision. "You prepared the sword to fail," Holmes continued. "You planted whispers of a curse so that suspicion might fall upon shadow, not upon flesh. You buried a glove beside the chapel, thinking to rid yourself of incriminating stain. And when the forged papers threatened to unseat your nephew's inheritance, you silenced him, forever." Lady Eleanor, who had entered with others roused by the commotion, gave a cry of horror. The widow covered her face, while Henry muttered something half incredulous, half fearful. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "The web you spun has collapsed, Sir Reginald. And now, in the sight of your kin, I declare you the author of this tragedy." The uncle's composure, long held with iron will, broke at last. He gave a harsh laugh, brittle as breaking glass. "So, the great detective unmasks me," he sneered. "Yes, I sought to break the line. Why should I, who bore the burdens of this house, watch it pass to a wastrel boy who squandered its legacy? Why should I live in shadow, while he claimed the title? The sword was ours by blood, yet it chained me as surely as iron fetters. I freed myself, with steel, with fire, with cunning." His voice rose, the words spilling forth like poison. "You speak of curses. The only curse upon Redgrave is its own rotting bloodline. Weak heirs, foolish widows and servants who whisper of ghosts. I am no villain, Holmes. I am a man who took what was denied him. I felt a shudder course through me at the rawness of his hatred. Holmes, however, regarded him with a coldness more terrible than anger. "Greed, Reginald, is the oldest of sins," Holmes said softly. "And always it ends the same way, with ashes, with ruin, with the weight of guilt that no man may bear." The uncle's hands clenched, his chest heaving with unspoken fury. The silence that followed seemed to tremble, as though the very walls anticipated the storm about to break. It came with startling suddenness. With a guttural snarl, Sir Reginald tore a dagger from within his cloak, the blade glinting with cold light. His voice rang with a last, desperate cry. "You've uncovered the curse, Holmes. But can you break it?" He lunged. In that instant, time seemed to slow. The shadow of the blade arcing through the air, the gasp of Lady Eleanor, the widow's scream echoing through the hall. I sprang forward, revolver drawn, but Holmes stood firm, his eyes blazing with the terrible clarity of one who had foreseen this very moment. With a swift sidestep, Holmes deflected the strike, his hand locking Reginald's wrist with iron strength. The dagger clattered to the stone floor, its ring a final knell. Servants rushed in, seizing the uncle as he struggled like a maddened beast, his face twisted in unrepentant rage. Holmes bent, his gaze fixed upon the fallen dagger. "So ends the phantom of Redgrave Manor," he said quietly, "not with a curse, but with the naked hand of human malice." I stood in silence, my heart pounding, as the truth lay bare before us all. The ghost was unmasked, yet the shadow it cast seemed darker still, as though some stain had settled upon the house forever. Sir Reginald Redgrave was led away in irons before the assembled household, his once imposing figure diminished by disgrace. The servants, who had whispered of ghosts, presence lingered. The hall was not freed by his absence. It remained cloaked in the same gloom that had greeted us upon arrival, as though the house itself were unwilling to let go of its ghosts. It was only when the household had withdrawn to restless sleep that Holmes spoke fully, his voice low in the quiet of our chamber. "You see, Watson, the Redgrave sword was never cursed by steel, nor by spirit. Its fracture was but a symbol, the outward ruin of what had long been broken within. The true curse lay here." He tapped his temple lightly, then placed a hand upon his chest. "In the minds and hearts of men. Greed, ambition, envy, the endless contest for inheritance. Those are the demons that haunted this family." He paused, his gaze fixed upon the fragments of the sword we had recovered. For generations they revered this relic as a token of honor, yet it became the vessel of deceit. A noble name brought low not by destiny, but by the basest of human vices. I said nothing, for his words rang too true. I had seen the widow's trembling, the heir's resentment, Eleanor's silent dread, all the poisons of distrust. A curse indeed, though no spectre had cast it. Holmes leaned back, weary yet unyielding. "Mark it well, my friend. When men whisper of ghosts, it is often to disguise the living sins they dare not name." The night pressed heavily upon me, and though Holmes's reasoning had stripped the mystery of its phantoms, I found my spirit restless. Drawn by unease, I wandered once more into the gallery. There, looming at its end, was the portrait of Sir Alaric Redgrave, the armoured knight who had watched silently over the house for centuries. By the pale light of the moon, the painted eyes seemed to glimmer with cold life. I told myself it was but trick of shadow, yet I could not shake the feeling that his gaze followed me, stern, unyielding, alive with judgment. A shiver coursed through me as I recalled the servants' whispers, and though I knew better than to credit superstition, I felt as though some unseen presence weighed upon me. Was it memory alone, or did this house indeed harbour something beyond reason? Holmes found me there, and though I laughed uneasily at my own folly, I could not deny the dread that gripped me. "Strange, Holmes," I confessed. "The crime is solved, yet still I feel the eyes of that night upon us, as though the house itself disapproved of our intrusion." Holmes regarded the portrait for a long moment, his expression unreadable. We stood together in silence until Holmes at last spoke, his voice low and reflective. "There are ghosts, Watson, though not of the kind that walk in armour or whisper in corridors. The ghosts that haunt us most are those we carry within, our memories, our betrayals, our unrepented sins. They do not fade with the passing of time, they linger, waiting to be confronted." He turned his keen gaze upon me, softer now, touched with a strange melancholy. "For the Redgraves, that sword was not merely steel. It was the mirror of their pride, their greed, their decay. When it broke, it was but the outward sign of a legacy already shattered. That, Watson, is the true haunting of Redgrave Manor." I felt the weight of his words settle upon me, and in that moment I understood the unease that clung to the place. No exorcism of spirits could cleanse it, for the shadows were born of human hearts. Holmes laid a hand upon my shoulder. "Come, my friend. Our work here is done, yet remember, some houses carry their past as chains, and some chains rattle louder than any ghost." We departed Redgrave Manor at dawn. The mist clung thick about the grounds, veiling the chapel and the oaks, wrapping the house itself in a shroud. From the carriage I looked back one last time. The manor loomed against the paling sky, its windows dark, its stone walls damp with night. It seemed less a dwelling than a sentinel of sorrow, watching its inhabitants with a gaze as cold and unyielding. Still followed us, watching, waiting, unwilling to let its secrets rest. Holmes stood at the carriage window as the manor's outline dissolved into the mist. His voice, calm yet edged with finality, broke the silence. "Superstitions, Watson, are but veils men draw to excuse their own vices. The sword bore no curse. It was human greed, sharpened over generations, that shattered both steel and bloodline. That is the true phantom haunting Redgrave. And now, a question for you. What do you think was Sir Reginald's gravest mistake? Breaking the sword, trusting superstition, or underestimating Holmes? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, remember to comment, subscribe, and share it with those who love a dark puzzle well told.